A long time ago, in a kingdom far, far away, there was a Western ally. He was called the Shah of Iran, or, as he called himself, the King of Kings. The Shah had come to power courtesy of the British and Russians during the Second World War and concentrated all power in his own hands with the help of a CIA-backed coup in 1953 that overthrew the left-leaning, democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh. The Shah ruled his kingdom with an iron fist. He crushed all domestic opposition. His secret police, Savak, hunted down his enemies in every corner of the globe, torturing those they caught and assassinating those that they could not. He bought arms from the West on a prodigious scale.
You are Britain's biggest arms customer at the moment. Do you mean to keep it that way?
If the world situation stays what it is, we have no other choice.
How effective is the cooperation that Britain is doing with Iran at the moment on military equipment?
Well, I think it's very substantial. Most of our armor is British. And we have given you a specification for a new tank, which eventually, when it will roll out of the factory, that day it will probably be the best tank in the world. Why do we do it? Well, we just look around us and see how many tanks are in the hands of some people who one day could eventually be alien to us.
Are you talking about the Russians?
I said all around us.
But eventually, in 1979, the Shah was overthrown in a revolution that contained a very powerful working class struggle, although those that eventually came to power were more moderate religious leaders who had also been long-time victims and opponents of the Shah.
Almost 40,000 refinery workers went on strike today, virtually cutting off Iran's petroleum exports.
University students demonstrating in Tehran, shouting death to the Shah, pledge allegiance to the Islamic movement of the Ayatollahs.
The number killed in Tehran since the beginning of the month is probably well over 100. But people in this crowd were saying and believing 7,000 had been killed. Emotions over the dead and the rumors of dead are high. Every day here now, the demonstrations and arrests go on. Rumors in Tehran say people are being armed and may soon start firing back at the troops.
News there would be some kind of announcement about a new government came after yet another day of running confrontations in the center of Tehran.
The new Iran was, understandably, given the long history of pro-Western despotism that the Shah had represented, not well disposed to the West. So the West encouraged and armed its ally, Iran's neighbour, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, in a war with Iran which lasted 8 years from 1980. The war was long and hugely costly to both sides, leaving between 1 million and 2 million dead. The war of mutually assured destruction was not of great concern to the West, as long as it disabled the Iranian regime, leaving it weakened and isolated in the region. And there the situation might have rested had not the United States backing for Saddam convinced him that he would have United States support in his long-running dispute with Kuwait. Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait proved to be a grievous miscalculation for Saddam, turning him from a Western asset into a Western enemy and triggering the First Gulf War. The US easily dislodged Iraq from Kuwait, but did not lead as easily to regime change in Baghdad. For that, years of sanctions and a second Gulf War in the aftermath of 9/11 were necessary. But even this did not deliver what the US really wanted: Iraq as a stable, pro-Western economic and political dependency in the heart of the Middle East. Instead, whatever oil and other benefits the invasion of Iraq brought, the long-sought politically reliable regime was not one of them. In fact, the country was destroyed, and the government which eventually emerged was pro-Iranian, and Iraq became home to pro-Iranian militias. Over 30 years, US policy had turned two critical pro-Western states, Iraq and Iran, from allies into enemies. Moreover, US policy elsewhere in the Middle East has led Iran to build alliances it could not previously have dreamt would be possible. US backing for Saudi Arabia in its war of choice against the Yemen meant that the Houthi regime looked to Iran. The Houthis are not Iranian puppets. Their popular base lies in the fact that they were the Yemeni variant of the 2011 Arab revolutions, eventually overthrowing the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh in 2014. But they were almost bound to fall into the Iranian sphere of influence, given the poverty of the Yemen, and that the US backing for Saudi Arabia and Israel was a threat to them. Similar constellations of allegiance would find both Hamas and Hezbollah looking to Iran. None of these movements are Iranian proxies, as much of the Western mainstream media repeatedly refer to them. They all have significant social bases of their own in their own communities, and they hardly need the Iranian regime to tell them why they need to oppose either Israel or US imperial power in the Middle East. They have plenty of reasons of their own to take that path. Western mainstream media find it difficult to grant the simple fact that Palestinians, Lebanese or Yemenis have quite sufficient grievances to make them hostile to the US and to Israel without outside manipulation. But the inability to recognize this simple fact leads to many false and contradictory assertions. When Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood was president of Egypt, it was supposed to be the fact that Hamas had links to the Muslim Brotherhood rather than to Iran that was the problem. Now Morsi has been overthrown by the Western-backed military dictator el-Sisi. It's the links with Iran that are meant to be decisive, in spite of the fact that Hamas is a Sunni organisation while the Iranian state is Shia. The Houthis are Shia, and this supposedly links them to Iran. But only 25% of Yemenis are Shia, so this cannot account for the Houthis' support in Yemen itself. Indeed, all the evidence shows that it is support for the Palestinians which is making the Houthis popular with Yemenis of all creeds. Perhaps the one thing that's allowed Iran to make allies across the Middle East, besides the continuing destructive acts of the Western powers, is the collapse of the previously hegemonic ideology of resistance to Western imperialism, pan-Arab nationalism. Since its days of ascendancy in the 1950s with Gamal Abdel Nasser as its iconic leader, pan-Arab nationalism has declined. The rise of dictators and army regimes using Arab nationalist rhetoric to bolster their support has undermined its mass appeal, and its compromises with imperialism, most significantly the Oslo Accords signed by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, has further diminished its appeal. The 1979 Iranian Revolution has cast the Iranian regime as a successor influence for many, though not all, in the region. So if there is one reason above all why a conservative and authoritarian regime in Iran has been able to cement alliances across the Middle East, it's not because others in the region envy Iranians their form of government. It's because the actions of the US and its allies, currently bombing 3 countries in a region and supporting a genocidal invasion of Gaza by Israel, have made the victims of US imperialism seek each other out for support, in spite of their very real differences and in spite of the fact that each of their struggles has its own peculiarities. US and Western wars and occupations, the destruction of whole nations in the Middle East, have brought cooperation between those who want to survive the onslaught and establish their independence from the colonial past and the imperial present.